All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank everybody for joining our Portfolio Analysis and Market Research webinar today. I'm Kevin Miner, and I just quickly want to go over some of the Zoom functions for our webinar today. There is a question and answer feature that is down towards the middle of your screen. It's a Q&A box. Please feel free to, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, to submit them in the Q&A box, and our presenters or myself will answer them accordingly. We also have a chat feature where you can, if you have a comment or would like to ask a question in the chat feature, you can submit it there. It's on the side to the bottom right. So with that being said, again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to chat me during the presentation, and I'll be happy to help you with the Zoom. And I will turn it over to Jonathan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks, Kevin, for starting us off. We're just going to dive right into it. We do have a lot of material to cover, and so I'm going to try to move through some of these introduction slides as quickly as possible. So as many of you already know, ValuePoint entered into a partnership with Oregon State University to look at our own cooperative contracts and portfolios, as we call them, and analyze them from various perspectives. So as part of that project, we had a project team that we're going to introduce to you today. We also obviously had a scope and goals. We looked at some very specific business processes and then applied those research components to those business processes. And then the last thing we'll do today, of course, is follow up with some question and answer. So to start off, I want to introduce you to the team that worked on this project with us. So we had a number of people from Oregon State University as well as from ValuePoint. So Wu and Shanoa are on the call with us today, and we'll be able to address some questions. Shanoa will be doing a bulk of the presenting on the market research, as she was instrumental in this project. Chris Wilson, who was another student that worked with us on this project, is not able to join us today, but was likewise very instrumental in the outcome of this project. Diane Lancaster and Sarah Hildebrand from NASPO ValuePoint were our executive sponsors. And we had a host of subject matter experts from states and also from internally on our cooperative contract team at NASPO ValuePoint, and this is just a sort of short sampling of those people. So I wanted to make sure I called out all of those people that were on our project team. So the goal of this project was really to develop models that we can use to support decision making. And that comes in various forms, market research, which you'll see today, comparable contracts, looking at our own sales. All of that is very applicable to the work that you all do in your states as well. Our goal was to create a process that was repeatable and transferable in our own portfolios, but also create tools that could be used at the state level as well. Obviously, there's some interpretation that has to be done. We're looking at a national level, and you're looking at a state level, but we'll speak to that as we go through this process today. Ultimately, I think our goals are the same as your goals, which is to reduce the amount of time it takes to develop solicitations, to create a standardized process to do market research across those different commodities or solicitations, and ultimately to create contract vehicles that have really high participation and have a positive return on the investment that we've put into them. So we looked at this through 4 business processes that were important for our cooperative contracts. And that first was the opportunity assessment. So when an idea comes to us, how do we evaluate that? If it passes that test, how do we develop a successful solicitation? After it becomes a contract vehicle, how do we review that in the interim to check its status and make sure that it's achieving the goals that we set out? And then, of course, at the end of its term, how do we evaluate its resolicitation potential? So the way that we are achieving that is by these 6 research components. So we have market analysis, price environment, comparable contracts, sourcing strategy, as well as some analysis of portfolio sales and expenses and portfolio participation. Those last 2 obviously only apply to existing portfolios and or contract vehicles that we have, because obviously we would not have data on brand new ones. So before we dive in, I want to spend the bulk of the time just really drilling down into each of these research components. But before we dive in, I want to set the stage a little bit on some of the things that we're going to talk about. So we're going to spend the bulk of our time on the market analysis piece. I think that some of the other pieces are very important, but I think that a lot of you already have access to this information. You already have processes in place to do a lot of those things. So we want to spend the bulk of the time on that market analysis, because it was really the bulk of what we were trying to achieve with this project, was to apply some of that market knowledge to these portfolios. So, I will also say that up front, that a lot of the market research data that we're working with, it really is qualitative data. So there's certainly some quantitative data in there, but for the most part, what you will be doing when you do market analysis and market research is reading reports from various sources, synthesizing that information about industries and companies and the marketplace through your own procurement expertise in your state, and then coming up with a result of how it applies to your particular procurement. I will also say that desktop research is really great, but certainly do not discount the importance of talking to your end users, of talking to suppliers directly, of talking to procurement professionals, maybe at different levels. If you have statewide contracts and you have higher education institutions or local governments, or maybe even other types of taxing districts, like in this particular portfolio that we looked at, lab supplies, water and sewer organizations were very important, so water districts and things like that as well. Talking to those end users to see what are the, both the product needs that they have, but also what are their barriers to participation in the contract from a terms and conditions standpoint, or a procedural standpoint, or some of those things as well. So we'll speak to that a little bit in the sourcing strategy element, but I just wanted to set the stage for some of the type of information that we're going to be talking about. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Shanoa Main from Oregon State University, who is going to start off by walking us through the market analysis component, which is where we will spend the bulk of the time.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Hi, my name is Shanoa Main. I am an MBA candidate at Oregon State University, and I'll walk you through how I did some of the market analysis on the lab equipment contract. And basically, we'll just kind of walk through what I would do, and then hopefully you guys will have some questions for us at the end, and maybe we can elaborate a little bit. Okay, and Jonathan, if you could go ahead and stop sharing, I can take over. So in doing a market analysis, the first thing I'm going to do is to identify the market that I'm in, and I'm sure you are all familiar with this. We'll start by identifying the market from both directions. So NAICS is going to be the first code that I find. So if we're looking at lab equipment and supplies, pulling up, we've got analytical laboratory instrument manufacturing, laboratory analysis type, and measuring instruments. That's going to be my first step. I think that's probably where I'll end up starting. So I've got my first code. And then to identify the rest of the market, I'll actually go from a company level as well. So one company that I know we're working with from the industry is going to be Thermo Fisher. And this database is it's a database that Oregon State University has subscription to. Depending on what research resources that you have at your level, they're not all going to look the same, but a lot of them are going to have some of the same information. So I've got Thermo Fisher Scientific, sounds like the same company. I'm going to go that direction. And I'm going to check out the NAICS code, and here we have a different NAICS code. So I know that there's at least two codes that I'm going to be looking at, but with most industries, and lab equipment is no exception, the companies and the industries, there's probably going to be a wide array of codes that you're looking at, a wide array of industries. Another thing I might do to find other codes or classifications is to look at a specific company's competitors. And here I see a couple of familiar names. Agilent is one that we talked about in our presentation and one that we did some specific research on. And so I would go to Agilent, and we have another NAICS code. So basically all I'm doing here is trying to identify what the overall market is going to be. For some industries, it's going to be a lot simpler. It's going to be one thing. And so you'll have the same code over and over again, or the same classification. But for some industries like lab equipment, it's going to be quite a few. And I would just kind of continue to kind of go down this research rabbit hole until I've kind of identified a group that I'm looking at. So I'll do the same thing, looking at their competitors, again from the company level, and to identify, and we've got another code. Now, once I've hit pharmaceuticals, I just kind of think I've probably gone a little too far. This is a little outside of what the portfolio is. So again, that's just taking some of my understanding of the market, my understanding of the portfolio itself, and saying, okay, this is too far. This is where I'm going to set my boundary. So after I've kind of identified the market, then I want to get some summaries of the market. And to do that at OSU, we use a subscription called Gale Business Insights Global. Again, whatever research databases that you have access to, they might have some of the same information, they might have different information. A lot of it is going to be exploring those resources and really determining what is in there. So again, I'm going to start at the company level because I want to make sure that I'm looking at the right things. Nope, uh-oh. Apologies. I'll have to re-sign in. It looks like it was a little bit of time. Okay, here we go. So, like I said, I'm going back from company level, and I want to do this because when we're talking about industries, when we're talking about markets and industries really are just a collection of individual companies. When we talk about the lab equipment industry, you know, there isn't a governing body that makes up what lab equipment industry is. It's going to be what the market and what NAICS has grouped into this kind of nebulous industry. So once I found my market, I'm going to look at some market share reports. And this is how the market has kind of grouped these competitors. And that's going to give me some insight into who the leaders are and then how the market is grouping. So for example, with market share reports, and again, these market share reports will probably be similar across research databases. So it is just finding what your research database has. But in vitro, I know is going to be something that I want to look at, molecular spectrometry, mass spectrometry. So basically what I would do in this case is start just copying down all of these lists, seeing who's involved in them. And how I might apply this information is to say the market has grouped itself into kind of spectrometry and chromatography and in vitro. And so maybe those would be market bands that I might look at including in a solicitation or a resolicitation. So the next thing that I'm going to do is to look at individual company profiles. And part of what I'm looking for here is the risk of doing business with a company. So kind of in the same way that an investor would look at whether they want to buy shares of stock, procurement offices are going to look at whether they want to work with the company. They want to see the supplier relationships. They want to see if they're stable. They want to see if they're dependable. And these are important in the same way that they would be to investors, they're going to be important to procurement professionals. And so depending on your research database, again, we have some company financials that we can look at. And there may also be investment reports, and that's kind of where I'm going to focus. Give it a minute to load. So here's some of our financial information, and important information that we might glean here is, how much is the company spending on research and development? That's going to be important because in technology-heavy industries, you're going to want a company that is growing and investing and improving. I would say, like many of these things, it's just about reading through the data and kind of putting it in the context of your industry. So for example, from an investment report, what I'm really looking for is the risk of the company. I'm looking to make sure that they're growing, that they're going to be stable, that if I order products from them, that I'm going to have a good relationship with being able to get those products, right? As a procurement professional, I think that's one of the things that you're looking at. And so I think those are important parts. So then to look at the industry as a whole, depending on, again, what resources you have, you can actually take those NAICS codes that we found, and one of the tools that I used in this summer's research was a Plunkett report, which again is from this Global Business Insights. And I just searched that by NAICS code. And then we get this nice analysis of kind of the forecasts of the industry, some benchmarks from the industry. And again, these are financial, but what we're looking for, and excuse me while I scroll real quick, what we're looking for on this is kind of the revenues of the industry and the growth rate. Again, it's going back to the stability of the industry, their worth as a partner. And then we're looking for the overall size of the industry. And again, this is just, there's a lot of information, and I would really advise that you just kind of sit down, read through it, put it into the context of your portfolio. When I'm looking at companies, the next thing that I'll do on a company-specific level is to look for mergers and acquisitions. And one of the important things to know in mergers and acquisitions is who are you actually doing business with. In the lab equipment portfolio, this was actually a really important piece because NASPO ValuePoint has a contract with VWR, but within the time frame of the contract, VWR had actually been bought by a different company. And so moving forward, when you're doing a resolicitation, you would actually be doing business with a different company at the head. And so it's important that you know what's going on there. So if I'm looking for some information about companies specifically, I'm just going to go to their own website. And one of the things that I'll look for is investor information. And again, you're looking at investing in this company as a partner in your state. And so some investor information that I might look at are those, some of the prices that we have looking up, and these are stocks, but stocks are going to give you really good information about the trajectory of the company, the stability of the company, kind of these important milestones. And then I'm also going to look at their news releases. Now, remembering that companies are usually going to release good things, but we can see the news releases, especially in investor information, is where we're going to get our mergers and acquisitions. We're going to get quarterly reports, which will contain a lot of really good information about companies. Additionally, they'll also put out new product releases, product changes, partnerships. All of these are kind of qualitative information that are really important to the context of a company. I think the next piece that we did was to estimate market size. And I know this was one that a lot of people had some questions about, so I'll try and do my best to work through it. So when we're looking at the actual, and I'm sorry, I've got so many tabs open. This is one of the risks of doing research. So when we were looking at trying to determine the overall size of the market and the share that NASPO has, and let me just share this real quick. So this was our market capture, and kind of what we were looking at is what is the size of the market in each state, at state and local. And to get this information, we actually grabbed these state spend and local spend numbers from the census, and that was from their annual survey of states and local government finances. And then using that Plunkett report that we found earlier, we can see the total size of the lab equipment market, and I'll show you that one again. Sorry while I scroll. So here we have the total size of the lab equipment market. It's 18.4 million, 18.4 billion, or 6.1 billion, depending on how narrow you want it to be, compared to all industries. So what this is saying is that this big blue piece includes cars, airplanes, legal services, real estate. This is kind of all industries in the United States, and then this little sliver is the piece that is lab equipment. So we wanted to take that number and use it as a proxy to determine how much lab equipment spending there was in each state, or how much of the market size is going to be. So we use kind of those overall numbers to get our percentage of what is available in the market. So this is what we estimate is the total lab equipment market, and then we just broke that down by state and local, and it's just multiplying that that number with the total spend, and then adding in some value point numbers to get value point market share. Now, as states, you're actually going to have better information than we did, because each of you will already have the amount that you spend. So, you'll have a better piece of information than we do on that one.
Yeah, just to jump in there, this, like Shanoa was saying, with the data that you have, one of the big pieces that we struggled with, looking nationally is, and I'm sure you can all relate to this, getting to that number of what is sort of your discretionary spend, as what is the spend that is eligible to be spent on these things, backing out things like Medicaid payments or other types of spending that is not really discretionary to be used on procurements or goods and services or things like that. It can be difficult at the national level. That was certainly a challenge for us because the financials are quite a bit different state to state. To the extent that you have better information on what your discretionary spend is, you can plug that in, and then knowing the other pieces of information, what's the size of the overall market, what's the percentage of that of all of the market, if you will, you can then get to a more granular number. Now, that being said, I know it may be difficult for even you in your own state to know the spend of all the local governments and all of the local entities. So you can turn back to the census for information like that. And here in a moment, I'm actually going to walk through some data sources. And at the conclusion of this webinar, we will send you a list of data sources that you can use. Many of them are publicly available. A lot of the data you'll find is from the Census Bureau or the Bureau of Economic Analysis or the Federal Reserve. So we'll send you a list of those. And then also some of these paid services that we've mentioned as well, which you may be able to partner with with a university in your state or purchase them yourself, certainly as well, to get access to some of that other information. So with that, I'll turn it back to Shanoa.
Yep, and if you want to go ahead and share those slides. So those really are the big research sources that I use, and again, it's just going back through those and reading them, putting them into the context, adding more companies, and with research, there's always going to be more that you can look at. There's always going to be another company, another industry that you can add to your analysis. But I wanted to present a few kind of basic business frameworks that you can use to look at industries and look at companies. So if you want to share those slides. So this is the PESTLE framework, and this is kind of a way of looking at an industry, and one thing that it can do is provide kind of a checklist of kind of pieces of an industry that you want to look at and kind of the effects that those pieces have on an industry. And again, if you're looking at a company or an industry and thinking about partnering with them on a contract or deciding, where you want to direct your state spend, these are going to be good things to look at. So in the PESTLE framework, there's legal and political ramifications, and those are going to be like regulations. You guys are probably going to have a much better idea of those than the general business person, so you have a big advantage there. And then economic forces, and when we talk about economic forces, we think about, discretionary spending, those kinds of things. Sociocultural forces are going to be, what's going on with people, what's going on with the culture. Technological, for example, in lab equipment, we know that more and more lab equipment is getting sophisticated software, and it's going to need updates. So that's something that we learned from doing a PESTLE analysis. And then ecological forces, again, are just the way in which the environment and resources interact with your industry and specifically with your company. Okay. The next thing to look at in industry as a whole are going to be Porter's 5 forces. Porter was a professor of business at Harvard, and he developed these forces, which are just ways of looking at how profitable an industry is. And these are particularly important to you because you actually are in these forces. You are the bargaining power of buyers, and you also have these forces exerted upon you with the bargaining power of suppliers. And so really what these forces do is tell you how much bargaining room you have and how much power you have within the industry. And that can really inform a lot of your resolicitations or your solicitations in a really important way. Okay. Oh, I didn't have anything else. Sorry, Jonathan. The next piece is just that the SWOT analysis. So when we're talking about SWOT analysis, that's looking at a company individually and specifically, and there are kind of 4 things that you can look at there, which will give you an insight into the company, how it does business, maybe how you'll fit into doing business with the company, and that's strengths, their weaknesses, their opportunities, and threats. For example, in the lab equipment portfolio, what we found was that there was an opportunity, especially in states that have legalized marijuana, because there's a huge increase in the demand for lab equipment because of that specifically. Again, these are just very qualitative resources, and it is just about kind of, reading through reports, reading through analysis, and kind of fitting that into the context of the industry and of the government and of procurement. The next thing that we looked at, oh, and I'm sorry, I am going to take it back now, is to look at comparable contracts. And from NASPO's point of view, those comparable contracts are other cooperative contracts. I'll just share this real quick. And there isn't really any secret sauce on doing this analysis. The magic is that I just kind of Googled them. So, you know, I happen to know one of the big cooperative contracts is Omnia. There we go. And so I'll just go in there, look for their lab equipment portfolio. And actually, if it's taking too long, I'll probably just use Google to go all the way to Fisher, because I happen to know that they have a Fisher contract. And also, NASPO has a Fisher contract, which is why we're focusing so much on Fisher during this. So the next thing, I'm just going to look at their contracts, read through what they have, read through the contracts documents. Again, you guys are actually going to be much better set up to do this information because you will already know if you have a contract with Omnia. And you'll know what your contract is and potentially what other states have as well. Other things that I might look for are other states that are in the same kind of size that I am, other regional states, and that's just looking for individual state contracts. Again, you guys are better set up to find that information. So once I've done that, I'll actually just start to put together a little bit more of a quantitative approach to finding those contracts and looking specifically at maybe some terms and conditions. And really all I'll do in this is just start to fit these specifics into a kind of spreadsheet so that I can easily compare. And this is just about tracking down that information and maybe synthesizing it to a sentence or two and really making it so that it's easy to start comparing directly across. And then finally, when we're looking at doing sourcing strategy, as Jonathan said, one of the big pieces of information that we wanted to find was to just conduct interviews. And so, you know, have a conversation with your end users, have a conversation with procurement professionals in other states, other procurement professionals in your office, have a conversation with suppliers, with the universities, with experts in supply chain and business, and, you know, ask questions. And then at the end of, you know, what we have done at Oregon State is to set up this interview protocol, which is a set of questions that we think are important to ask, but it's always about the conversation. And I always like to end the conversation by following up with suggestions for who I should talk to next, especially in your end users and your experts. They're going to be the people who know who else in their industry you should get feedback from, and you'll actually learn a lot from going from that direction. And I think that is it on my side.
Yeah, thanks, Shanoa. Yeah, and just to follow up a little bit on the sourcing strategy. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you can glean from those types of interviews. I mean, some of the things that you should be looking for as you conduct those interviews will be you know, ways that you can evaluate those companies. So certainly you can take things like Shanoa talked about in the market. You can understand the risk of doing business with those companies. You can, you know, evaluate your experience with them to the extent that you have had experience with them in the past. But some of the things that are, you know, really important to understand are, can those companies fulfill the needs you have? Do you have, you know, interdependencies in lab supplies? We found that there was lots of equipment that has, you know, consumables and other things that are proprietary to that. So do those companies, you know, satisfy those requirements for your existing needs was something that came up. As we, and that's really from the end user perspective, but also from the procurement professional perspective, through that interview process, we found that there were some terms and conditions in our contract vehicles master agreement that were preventing the use of the contract for some entities, particularly universities, local governments. And so in this case, there was a per item limit that was designed, you know, originally to make sure that you were if you're buying a very expensive piece of equipment, that you do a sort of single procurement for it, but it was somewhat limiting for some of the entities that didn't have those types of restrictions. So that was a recommendation that we made, was to potentially move that from, in our case being a cooperative, move that from the master agreement to a participating addendum to allow individual entities that are participating in the contract to set their parameters on what they want that to be. So those are the kind of things that you can look to glean from those, that sort of qualitative interview data, and so certainly don't discount that as you go through the process. So I will, I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to dive into the pricing environment component. So pricing environment is obviously a critical piece of any procurement, and obviously you will go through a price evaluation process that will meet your legal requirements in your state. But it's also important to understand what is happening in the market as it relates to the price environment, what's driving that, how are the suppliers set up from a cost structure standpoint, and how does that influence your negotiation abilities. So we used a few different tools for this, but predominantly we use Procurement IQ. And the good thing about that, of course, is that NASPO members get access to Procurement IQ through their membership with NASPO. This is not necessarily a training on all of the features of Procurement IQ, because they are pretty substantial. We do have resources for that are available, and so certainly we can provide existing webinars that we have, recordings of those, but also we will continue to have webinars and other training materials for that. And Kevin, who's on the call with us today, can serve as your point of contact for that. But I'm actually going to dive into Procurement IQ and show you a couple examples of how we did this analysis for this particular commodity of lab supplies, and then finish up with how I can sort of interpret that information. So let me pull up Procurement IQ. All right. So when you log into Procurement IQ, this is the screen you will see, just like I see it whenever I log in. And it's a fairly simple interface. So you'll remember Shanoa was talking about those NAICS industry codes. You can use those to search here as well. But for our purposes, we will short-circuit that process and just search for one of the many, actually, sort of like sub-industries, if you will, that exist in Procurement IQ in the lab supplies market. So if we, grab one of these as an example, laboratory glassware, for example, is one that we looked at. And if we dive into that report, it's a substantial report, has lots of information. All of these tabs have drill downs that you can drill down into very particular information. But for our purposes, in this section, we're looking at the price environment. And so what we would do is, let me pull back up, is we would dive into that particular section. So as you look here, you can see there's a price environment section that we will drill to, and it will give you lots of information. So right at the top, it's going to give you some summary information about what does that trend look like over time in the preceding 3 years, but then also what does your forecast look like. So in this case, they're about the same. This is a fairly sort of modest growth rate. It does include some information about benchmark pricing. This is obviously quite generalized. It has a wide price range. Depending on the commodity you're looking at, this may be more or less useful for your particular use case. In lab supplies, where it's such a broad catalog, this was not a particularly relevant piece of information to us, but what were things like the pricing model. So you can read through this information. You can see that typically laboratory glassware is a cost-plus pricing model, which is certainly good to know. And it also will start to dive into the price drivers. And so this is certainly a key component. So, what are those big price drivers in this particular commodity? So in this case, we look at things like the price of glass, wages in that industry. We can also look at particular importance at this vendor cost structure and see what are their profit margins and how do these different parts and pieces play into that. So one of the things to think about here is what of this is affected in a lot of ways by macroeconomic factors. So if you think about things like glass or steel or other sort of raw materials that go into a product, to the extent that those start to make up a large portion of that cost structure, it can be volatile depending on what other factors are influencing that. And there's a couple different ways to handle that, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end on how to interpret this. But certainly if you think about something like steel, we've had, obviously in recent years, there's been quite a bit of volatility in the steel market due to tariffs and other sort of macroeconomic factors. So certainly you can think about controlling for those in your solicitation in a couple of different ways. Certainly you could try to lock in lower pricing for a longer period of time if it's possible for you to negotiate that. But you could also just think about backing that out entirely. Do you take the cost of the tariffs and separate them out so you are not on the hook for higher pricing if those tariffs sort of fall off later? So, thinking about things that have volatile price drivers and how to control for those in your solicitation is a really critical component of the price environment. This is a great tool that helps you dive into that. It will also give you some other sort of external demand drivers that may have an influence on pricing. So those will be, larger trends like total expenditure on healthcare, government funding, et cetera. But this is certainly a great way to find a lot of that information about pricing in a particular commodity. So by comparison, this is a product that has a relatively low profit margin, based a lot on raw materials of glass and plastic and materials and other resins. Conversely, if you were to look at something like software as a service like CRM software, and you were to look at its price environment, it'll be substantially different. So we can see that the price summary is quite a bit different, but of note is you have substantially higher profit margins. The bulk of the price drivers are wages. You have some reliance on the price of computers and other equipment that's required as part of that. But for the most part, you're looking at sort of intellectual property in this case. And so you have a very different way of approaching this negotiation. It's a much higher profit margin. The model is a subscription model. So you're typically going to want to approach this differently. And I will jump back into my slides now and talk a little bit about how you could approach those different situations. So, looking at that profit margin, you want to arm yourself with current information on the cost structure. So looking at that procurement IQ report, seeing what that vendor cost structure looks like, thinking about those macroeconomic factors like steel prices, like tariffs and things that could influence those raw material costs. But you also want to look at that pricing model. So in the example we just looked at, for a subscription model, you might approach those negotiations with an eye towards, an increased contract length for subscriptions will often yield a better price. The timing of the payment, so paying more money up front, will often yield a better price for those pricing models. But if you think about something like cost plus, that length of time is actually harmful to the vendor because they don't want to lock in something that has potentially volatile price drivers. So they will be more likely to look at something like volume discounts. You also want to think about those volatile price drivers and like I said, either back them out entirely and account for them in your pricing as a separate line item that can fall on or off depending on changes, or lock in low pricing. There have been many examples, particularly in the airline industry, where companies have been able to be very successful by locking in a good price on things that they consume a lot of, like jet fuel. So many airlines have done well by locking in low pricing for a long period of time on what is a volatile commodity. So that's certainly something to think about. So moving on, some of the other things that we looked at as we went through this were just some basic portfolio sales and expense analysis. And you can certainly apply this to your own systems as well. This will be a little bit different depending on the technology that you have in place. Certainly to the extent that you have a very advanced e-procurement system, you may have tools directly in that program to do a lot of this analysis without having to do much additional work. You certainly, I know many states are using tools like Tableau or Microsoft Power BI or a whole host of other business intelligence tools that are available. Certainly certainly those are good options as well. For the purposes of showing you a couple things today, I actually did all of this just in Excel. I cheated a little bit and used a couple other tools and a couple places to clean up my data ahead of time, but generally speaking, this analysis can be done in Excel or tools that most of you should have. So a lot of the things we're looking at are fairly simple, and they're not exceptionally complicated to do. And so one of the first things we looked at was return on investment. So in our case, we're looking at, what are those sourcing costs, and then what is the administrative fee revenue that we're generating off of that. That may or may not be relevant to your state, but certainly you are going to want to understand what are the resources you're putting towards a contract vehicle, and what's the usage of that contract. And this was a metric that we used. In this case, for our laboratory supplies contract, it had a very positive ROI. And I'm going to dive into Excel here in just a second and show you a couple examples of how this works. You can certainly also look at trends, which is likewise a very simple analysis, but good to know as you're examining how your contract's performing. Importantly to us, what we were looking at were who are the contributors to the growth in that contract, and who is also contributing to a reduction in the spend on that contract. And so we looked at that for this portfolio. You could certainly look at that for yours as well. Now, the difference between what we're looking at and what you're looking at would be we're at a national level looking at state-by-state spending for the most part. You may be looking at this from an agency perspective. So instead of seeing states here in the left-hand column, you may see agencies or buying entities that you have in your state. But the same still applies. You can see if what the usage looks like, who's really been using the contract, who has not been using the contract. Certainly looking at the market share of the contractors you have is good to know. This is an important piece to compare back to your market analysis. So as you analyze what is VWR's position in the overall market and what's their position in our portfolio. And you can see in this case, VWR actually outperforms their industry market share, but their market share overall within the contract is quite stable. For us, and I think this is a comparable analysis that you would want to do in your state as well, is to look at what are the types of entities. So in this particular portfolio, higher education is really important. And that is going to mean that we are going to want to spend some time interviewing those end users, and that's certainly something we did as part of this contract. So now I'm going to jump into Excel and show you a couple things. I'm not going to make this an Excel training, and I also want to be conscious of your time, but I do want to show you a couple things about how this can be done quite easily within Excel. So starting with some very basic data, just state level spend data, we brought this information in. I would suggest if you're going to use Excel, there's better ways to do this, like I said, but using a pivot table is a great way to be able to slice your data in a variety of different ways. And so from the single data source, we were able to actually create pretty much the bulk of the charts that you just saw. So if we think about something like trends, we were just looking at quarterly sales over time. That's a relatively simple thing to do. So all we have to do is drag our year and quarter into our rows, drag our columns out of there, and we have the data formatted in the way we need in order to generate this trend analysis. And just as quickly, if we want to look at our growth over time and split it up by state and year, if we jump back to that pivot table, we can drag our state name to the rows, we can drag our year to the columns, and now we have the information formatted in such a way that we can produce this and drop some formulas in here to calculate our 3-year growth and see who's contributing to the top and who is at the bottom. One of the things that this analysis led us to is we can see there's really strong growth. So if you look at the top 10 numbers here, if you will, these cells at the top, you can see these are relatively large numbers and that the 3-year actual growth. And the percentage growth is significant as well. If we were to look at the bottom These numbers are much smaller, but one thing that did stand out to us is that there was one state that had a substantial reduction, that had been spending a significant amount of money that now is not. So that's a data point that we certainly want to investigate to see, what's the cause for that reduction occurring in this case. Switching gears a little bit, we talked a little bit about the revenue and expenses. This is a separate analysis based on the revenue and the different expenses we have. You may have to quantify that in a different way depending on whether you collect administrative fees or not, but certainly trying to find a way to quantify your time investment and the monetary investment in the contract and its return is certainly something worthwhile to do. So another thing I want to spend a little bit of time on is thinking about how you normalize this data in a way that is meaningful. So we're looking at states, certainly, and that is a higher level. And so we're looking at things like per capita and spend per $1 million of GDP, for example. And so the way you do that is by collecting some of that census data and aggregating it with your spend data. So in this case, just taking all of our states and adding in their 2018 population to calculate the per capita spend. So as an example, if we were to look at just raw spend for one particular year and sort that information, we'll see California rise to the top. Well, California also has a population of almost 40 million people and a GDP of $3 trillion. So certainly they're going to have a higher spend relative to other states. However, once we normalize that for population, we can actually see that South Carolina, Montana, Alaska, Idaho are at the top of that list, and California is much further down. So, it's interesting. You can do this analysis in your own state as well. I'm going to show you in just a moment how you can access some of this data. Population data is available at a fairly granular level from the Census Bureau. So to the extent that you have some information about the entities that are spending or the agencies that are spending, you can normalize that data. Another way to normalize it, if you're looking at agencies, would be to look at their spend relative to your total spend in your state in your state budget. And so you could normalize the size of that agency. You could also look at the number of employees of that agency. Any way to sort of control for the size of an agency is a way to look at that. So I know, in my state in Kentucky, for example, the Transportation Cabinet is a exceptionally large agency, and there's other agencies that are much smaller. So we'd want to control for those different sizes. Otherwise, the analysis might yield some misleading results. Another really critical component, maybe one of the most important when you're looking at your own spend, is how do you control or how do you gather some information on what you're spending money on when your product information that you're getting may not be super clear. And so I would say that the first way to look at that would be if you have an e-procurement system and you can collect better data up front, this analysis is actually quite simple. It's only made complicated by the fact that you have dirty data or don't have the data at all. So as an example, I pulled, this is just one contractor of lab supplies for the period that we were looking at. And there was something in the order of 120,000 different unique product descriptions and codes that were purchased under the contract over that period of time. So obviously that's a big catalog. Some portfolios and contract vehicles will be a little bit simpler. But in this case, it's a little difficult to analyze this data with that many different data points. So one of the ways that that we looked at that was through a couple different lenses. You can try to clean up your data, or to the extent that you have a commodity code of some kind that's being supplied, that is another good way to slice it up. Another thing to think about is as you establish bands in a contract, so in lab supplies, if you have a band or category for chemicals and one for spectrometers and another one for safety equipment, requiring reporting by those different bands is another way to help gauge how things are going. So in this case, whenever we were able to normalize this down to the UN spec commodity codes that they were providing, there were some anomalies in the data which aren't exactly commodity codes, but we were able to get some percentage numbers here that were more meaningful than the 1,200 plus different types of glove product descriptions that were provided in that analysis. So you can see that consumables, for example, were a big part of this particular portfolio relative to the other percentages, and it flowed down from there. So certainly, finding ways to get better reporting on the types of products that are being bought and categorizing them into a logical structure is very important to creating bans in a solicitation. So with that, I will jump back and finish up quickly here, and then I know we are about at our time. I am happy to stay on for some question and answer after the time if you are as well, but I understand if you need to drop off at that 4 o'clock mark. So another item that we looked at was portfolio participation independent of spend. So in our case, once again, we're looking at things like states with spend. You may be looking at agencies with spend, or maybe by county level data or other types of information. This is a relatively simple analysis, but meaningful because in this case, we were able to tell that there were 45 states and territories with sales, which is a very broad penetration into the market in our case. We also applied that per capita spend to look at things regionally, and this was one that really helped us find some interesting data points that I think I want to share with you, and sort of how you can apply them to your state as well. So, doing a per capita on a regional basis. And you could do this through county information that you have and break up the state into pieces that way, or there's other metrics that you could use, agencies as an example, as I said. We were able to see that, we had the Western region, which was overperforming, and we understood that because of NASPO's roots in WSCA. The Western states have tended to outperform the other regions, so that made sense to us. The Midwest and the Southern regions were pretty comparable, but the Eastern region was really underperforming. And as we dug into that, we were able to determine that was really driven by the fact that New York, which is the region's largest state, had much lower spend than average. And so that's the kind of information that you can find to apply that to your state. Maybe if you were looking at something that had, for example, high spend in the higher education realm, and you had one particular university that was underperforming the other universities on their spend relative to the size of their budget or the number of students they have, or something along those lines, that would be an example of how you could apply that within your own state. Another thing we looked at was participating addendum, and this may be a little bit different than what you would have in your own state, but certainly that's how entities, as you know, participate in our cooperative contracts. And so this is what we would consider to be a healthy participating addendum curve, the line showing a spike early in the contract's term, meaning that they had joined early on shortly after it was created, which is exactly what we want, and then we had continued to see a little bit of growth over time as well. So with that, I am right at 4 o'clock, so I will stop there and see if we have any questions. I will open it up for that at this point. So I don't see any open questions in the queue right now. Let's see. Does anybody have any questions? So I have a question from John Hall about how did all of this information turn into real-world savings. So we are right now in the midst of our solicitation for lab supplies. This was just completed over the summer, so we don't have any new data. Obviously, once that new solicitation is out there, we can take a look and see if hopefully the bans and changes we've made to the contract will generate additional sales in the future. But at this point, we do not have any new data at this point because that new version of this contract is not out yet. All right, so are there any other questions at this point? All right. Well, with that, I guess we will close up the webinar for today. Certainly, if you do have questions or are interested in more information, there's certainly a lot to digest here. We could probably spend as much time as we spent today on some, just one topic of each of those sections. So certainly if you have additional questions, you can reach out to me. My contact information is certainly on the NASPO website. You can also reach out to me via email at jhollinger, H-O-L-L-I-N-G-E-R, @naspo.org. This webinar was recorded, so you can watch it later if you're interested in particular items. And we also do have some additional webinars on Procurement IQ and some of the resources that we mentioned today. I will follow up with you and send you a list of sources that we mentioned today, both publicly available and otherwise, as well as a copy of our slide deck from this presentation, so you will have that as well. So with that, thank you very much for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you on the next NASPO webinar.